Are we set? Are we set? Good afternoon and welcome to this panel discussion. It's titled The Politics of Content, a Battle for Narratives. Just to sort of introduce to you the concept behind this discussion. In recent years, the rise and dominance of big tech and the globally accessible platforms, along with easy access to internet, has facilitated the emergence of a new information order. Technology was supposed to be an enabler of democracy, but it now also poses a challenge to free and open societies by way of the new information order. There are broadly three aspects to it. The public sphere is being increasingly gamed in favor of polarization. Political polarization, social polarization, cultural polarization. Existing cleavages in societies, those are being deepened. And third, new cleavages are surfacing. So this sort of requires us to focus our attention on misinformation or disinformation, the weaponization of information, and the conduct of big tech in their failure to robustly counter disinformation and weaponization of information, and also what is widely perceived as arbitrary censorship and algorithmic opacity, which contribute to governments, sovereign governments, failing to cope with what is now called the infodemic. I have a very distinguished panel with me. Ilyani Abdul Rahman, she is member of Twitter's Trust and Safety Council and member of the Global Diplomacy Lab in US. Dragan Barbutovski, he is in the office of the Prime Minister of Slovenia and he deals with communications. I have Marcin Olender, Government Affairs and Public Policy Manager and CEE Lead on Disinformation, Google, Poland. Julia Jaroschewski, she's a journalist without borders and member of the Global Diplomacy Lab in the US. Jani Vujica, he is Director Analytics and Research, Directorate of Global Engagement Center, US Department of State. So let's kick off with a question on how can democracies regain control over the narrative, the political narrative, the social narrative, the cultural narrative, and ward off intrusion and intervention, because there have been political intervention by way of trying to interfere in the processes of countries, in the affairs of countries. So how to stop it? Uh, would you like to kick off with that, Ilya?
So my name is Eliani, just to repeat that. And I just want to give you some context of where I'm from. So I'm from Twitter's Trust and Safety Council. I don't represent Twitter, so I don't get paid by them. I wish I was, but I wasn't. I'm not. So on the council, what we do is that we advise the company on the products in a beta version before they get rolled out. So I'm an expert on child online safety. But at the same time, we still have worked with Twitter, with Jack Dorsey, on issues of misinformation, hate speech, and disinformation early on. So the council was formed in 2016. I was its first female representative from Asia. And we worked with Dorsey. I met him twice in 2 years to work with his team on the formulation of these policies. And so, for example, what you saw on January 6th, we had told Dorsey back in 2017 what we saw was coming. And we said people who are verified with the blue ticks need to be held more accountable to things, and certain things need to be taken down more quickly. And so our warnings were ignored, and then you saw what happened last year. Anyway, so I have some statistics I want to share. I'm based in the US. I'm at Harvard University as well. I'm a student there. And what you see, for example, in the US is that 70% of Republicans who are registered believe that the last elections was a fraud. So 70% is a really large number. And what happens because of that is that it leads to a lot of opportunities for monetization of this kind of work. So it actually leads to commerce. You have a little cottage industry going on, and it proliferates on the different platforms. As a person that's doing public health right now, as a doctorate student, I think that what happened during COVID, we can learn certain things. So, for example, in the first wave, you can look at New Zealand. You can argue it's a small country, it's an island, all that stuff. But in the first wave, New Zealand was doing really well, 1,500 cases up to August 2020. It had 22 deaths. And something that I thought was interesting in terms of bridging the divide between misinformation, disinformation, was storytelling. It seems almost counterintuitive, but we have billions of people not talking to one another. One way to do that, to fight against that, is really doing storytelling. And so Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister, was giving stories of people who were really affected on the ground. Said, because you stayed home, this mother who had a son who had issues with immunodeficiency, he's safe, thanks to you. And so you can see like a lot of the data collected in New Zealand, it showed that people, these stories of compassion and care did actually help them with their own campaign in the initial wave, for example. I'll pass it over to you, Marcin.
You work in the Prime Minister's office. So how would you see, what are the ways and means of regaining control over the narrative?
I'm an old-fashioned guy when it comes to that, and I think the answer to that is content. I think we need to know really well what we're communicating about. And it all boils down, I always say, everything sort of starts or falls with the content. So if we, as communicators, because I'm on that side, I'm not on the sort of governance side, I'm on a communication side, I think what's really important that we know what we are doing. So that's what maybe I talk about content. So what are we talking about? What is the measures that we're doing or the decisions we are adopting? And then we can communicate this when there is a solid story. And I think this is where usually, from my point of view, and I've been doing mostly EU communication, also boils down to this content. So that's why I said I'm the old-fashioned content guy. Because what I have been doing mostly, as in almost 2 decades of my career, is telling people the story about the EU. What is it? What does it mean for you? How is it going to affect you or your family or your community? So that's why I come from the point of view that the government really needs to know, or whoever's communicating on the government side, what's in it for the people and how they're going to be basically affected by that. And I think that's the way, with a good content, we can do that. The second question, when it comes about storytelling, it's should the governments be doing storytelling or not? Is this something that we should be doing? And I think, for example, in Slovenia during COVID, we have done a little bit of a storytelling sort of approach to counter disinformation about COVID and vaccinations and all of that. So the question is that really storytelling? or is this, there's very thin line to propaganda and saying, oh, these people are doing it only because they've been paid. So for me, it's really careful if you go into the storytelling as a government, and we've seen attempts, of some governments to do this across the world, is, we need to be careful about this very thin line between one and the other.
So, may I react on that? I'm very happy to sit here because I'm a journalist, and I haven't seen many journalists sitting on panels here. I've seen moderators, though, and we speak a lot about information, dissemination of disinformation, misinformation, hate speech, etc. And I think media must be involved somehow in the whole process, right? Jumping on what you said, I've heard here so many times communicators speaking, PR people, governments, officials, and always speaking how do we reach the people again? How do we reach our audience? And I was always wondering to say, you always said, how can we bring the information to the people? And I said, okay, but you are in the role actually of communicators, as you said, so it's communication. For me, as a journalist, that is not information, right? This is a certain aspect of information, but if you bring together all those communication, I'd say then we as journalists give on information and the art of storytelling. And this is like, we as journalists have different formats and we tell stories, but we have opinion papers and we have reports, etc. And we retell stories about what has happened. And I would always say, making up a story is not good. So if you communicate, don't make up a story. Just think about how to communicate.
Marcin, what kind of content would be most effective in communicating with the largest possible number of people on concerns which are not only country-specific, but of global concern, climate change, security, supply chains? How do you get the story out?
Thank you so much, and hello everyone. Thank you for coming for a late panel. I think you will find the answer maybe not entirely satisfactory, because when you look at the internet as a whole and what we do, the answer to most such questions is it depends. So it depends on the audience, and the internet is actually great to tailoring messages to specific audiences, and this is what most successful companies and communicators do. They cater to a specific audience to get the message. And actually this is one of the biggest maybe both advantages and pitfalls of the internet, right? That you can actually fine-tune your message to a very small group, which used to be impossible with traditional media. Like it used to be mass media. Now it can be very targeted media. It's a completely different situation. So I think the answer would be, forgive me, I may say it, sidestepping, but it needs to be just tailored to who you're talking to, which kind of brings me to what I wanted to say in response to your introduction, where you pointed, this is exactly touches upon the nexus of the problem. You said that both the companies failed to effectively combat misinformation, and in the same sentence that they are also accused of arbitrary censorship, which is exactly the problem we are facing, that there are very conflicting views about what we need to do. And depending on who you ask, even in the US, you look at attempts to reform Section 230, and you have on the one side of the aisle people telling you have to repeal it and make platforms fully responsible for the content, and on the other side it's quite the opposite. We must forbid platforms to any sort of power over the content and make them mere conduits, right? Make them transparent. So there's a lot of conflicting views about what can and should be done about these. I agree. There's a lot of bad things happening. Some of them are natural phenomena. So, for example, the democracy issue. One may argue, and I think we do subscribe to this view, that the internet has democratized both access to information and the ability to impart information on others. But is that always a good thing? It has spawned some bad things, but would the right answer be to limit people's ability to communicate, that also might not be the right answer. So a more balanced approach, I think, is needed. Where appropriate, some limits have to be set. And if we're talking about misinformation, we have set these limits. COVID was mentioned, for example. In COVID, we deemed some kinds of misinformation to be so harmful to elicit a response which was just to remove them from the platforms. But that can't be a solution to everything, because I don't think there's a single jurisdiction where saying silly things or wrong things is illegal, right? I don't think the law or us should intervene when people just say wrong things. But we should perhaps think about intervening when people say misleading things in order to harm others. And I think this is where we should concentrate. They're really harmful, malicious actions, especially of nefarious hidden actors. I think that's where we should act.
So there is always this question of good disinformation and bad disinformation.
None is good, but some is worse.
Some is worse. I would ask Jani to come in on this. Good disinformation, bad disinformation.
Well, just unequivocally, all disinformation is bad disinformation, or is bad.
No, what I mean is that if it is not malicious, then it is not bad.
Well, so just by way of background, I come from the Global Engagement Center at the Department of State. Our mandate is to recognize, analyze, and then counter foreign state-sponsored disinformation and propaganda. And the panel on which we're sitting on is the battle for narratives. And I think it's very good that it's such a diverse group of panelists that we have. And to your point, I'm not a communicator or I'm a journalist. So the way I would answer this question is almost to phrase it as a prelude to the communicators that are doing the job of creating the content that they think is going to be effective and then choosing the avenues on how they respond to certain audiences. And by the prelude, I mean that I think that in the 21st century, in the digital age, that all democratic societies, if they are going to build a resilience to propaganda, disinformation, or let's just say malign influence more broadly, and take back the control of the narratives and make their narratives effectively, I think there's two crucial aspects that they need to operationalize. And this was partly my job at the Global Engagement Center. And the very first one is what I would personally call the foundational pillar of countering disinformation. And that is, first and foremost, much like anything else, understanding the environment in which you're operating in. So not having our communicators be burdened by going off of hunches of what they see in the information space, because maybe what they see on Twitter or Facebook, they may perceive that it is, viral or having an impact. But being able to invest in analytics to be able to quantify the information environment from a data-driven perspective, be able to have subject matter experts to write to that data and produce timely and actionable reports that they're able to hand to communicators to make them more effective when communicating, which I think ultimately enables them to, quote-unquote, take back the narrative. So that's the first bucket. And the second bucket is simply, I don't think that there's one center of gravity when it comes to the threat of disinformation. So governments alone cannot do this. Civic society alone cannot do this. Private sector alone cannot do this. And I don't mean for this to sound like a platitude, but we all do have to work together because everybody kind of has a different slice of the pie. And by working together, that does entail proactive willingness to build these relationships and trust between these institutions, so that maybe when a government does see a blatant disinformation campaign that's taking harm in a particular country, they're able to have that trust with the tech companies and present that evidence to them so that it does get taken down. But so partnerships as well as the analytics is kind of how I would bring context to this panel. Thanks.
Julia, there was a time when mainstream media was the dominant media, and all information would go through mainstream media. So content would be designed accordingly and context would be decided accordingly. There would be in place some sort of a fact check process. But the rise of new media, which is digital media, whether it's social media, whether it's direct messaging services, mainstream media is now being pushed to the margins, and governments, individuals, institutions, they are directly addressing people. Now, that removes the institutionalized process of fact check, of placing it in context, and also runs the risk of populism overtaking purpose. How do you see this unfolding scenario?
So I just remember the situation yesterday when we had politicians arriving here at the hall and coming and going back and forth. And we had a huge crowd of journalists running after them and interviewing them and getting statements, right? So, of course, imagine the whole scenario without journalists. You could have done that, for sure. So all the communicators would have run after their politicians, taking pictures and videos, putting them on Instagram, on Twitter, editing before, of course, contextualize it, to explain what is bad, where are we, what is happening, right? This is a whole long story and process that takes a lot of time. It takes professional acting. And then you have to think about the audience. I mean, the audience has to understand what's going on, and the audience must have the skills actually to find all of the information in the right places, right? So this is what journalists and what mainstream media do. They do contextualize, they do analyze, they put the information together and make it available to the audience. So just giving you this impression. Going back again, now I might not tell a story, but I will retell a bit of my work. It's just an example, but if you go to Brazil, because I work in Brazil lots of the time, and when we look to the elections we had in 2018, we had a president who actually copied the methods and strategies of Donald Trump, and he said, I don't need mainstream media anymore, right? I use social media, I use YouTube, whatever I want to. And he did not attend the public TV anymore. He did not go to the debates, and actually he won the elections because he had a huge army of his own sons actually communicating and putting his opinions out into the world. He used a lot of trolls and factories on the messengers, right? So I got hundreds and thousands of messages every week through messengers, and there were disinformation, yeah? So we don't call it fake news, but it's false information. It was really disinformation, and that was later on legally prosecuted, actually. So we have elections in Brazil in a month, and now suddenly this president actually went on TV because the public was asking for it. They were demanding it, right? Because he actually couldn't have done that without again. He was always voting against journalists. He denied journalists. He insulted them. He threatened them. But he actually could not go into this new political stage without going on TV because the audience is much broader and wider. And we had the discussion of disinformation and dissemination of many disinformations. So what has happened afterwards was, of course, that many people went on Instagram and on Twitter as well. But I think Instagram was really, really popular, and they said, okay, this was not journalism, right? So they attacked our president, asking it was not allowed, you shouldn't do it like this. And there it comes in again, fact-checking. It was not only a certain channel of TV who did fact-checking then, which is the very normal general methods of journalists. That is nothing new, right? We do fact-check all the time. It's just a very, very popular vocabulary actually being used during the recent times, but actually we always have done fact-checking. So coming back to the case in Brazil. So when that president was in the interview on TV, he was asked very normal classical questions on his work during the last presidency, and he lied. And the journalist said, okay, you're not, that's not true. And he denied it. And then you had fact-checking organizations, which was a cooperation of many different media institutions who would actually compete with each other, right? And NGOs working together to see if it's fake, or truth. And they had evidences that he lied. So there was a combination of all of them, right? It was social media, you had fact-checking organizations, you had mainstream media, which was working on actually bringing information to the audience which asked for it. And it was not only the president. All the candidates actually were on TV being interviewed and fact-checked afterwards. So just giving you a very small scenario again, how this, of course, changes, how social media and alternative media changes the whole media and information scenario. But for sure, mainstream media is not obsolete. You need them.
No, I didn't say it's obsolete.
Yeah.
I would like it to be very much mainstream. Yeah.
Sorry, just to answer, what you asked as well, and just following on what Julia said. First of all, maybe to answer good disinformation, bad disinformation. I mean, it is disinformation. We might say it might be misinformation. Example would be, I tell my friends like, oh, go to the pharmacy because you need to buy masks. They're running out. It's misinformation because that person goes into the pharmacy and there's actually plenty of masks there. But I just gave this information. We didn't intend to help somebody, and I don't have anything to it. I'm not gaining economically. I'm not doing this on behalf of somebody. I just was misinformed, and that's why
There's no intent.
There's no intent there, exactly. So just for that, for me, disinformation is really when somebody purposely makes something, up, fake news, lies, whatever, with a very clear goal, what it wants to achieve. Maybe wants to achieve, a sale of something, that, we see this a lot, this magical, medicine and cures and everything, or could be political, what we deal with as well. So that's just to that. But then I said, how we can counter all of this and get the narrative back. So one I talked before was about the content, what were we communicating about? So it's appealing, it's the correct and all of that. The other thing is media literacy. I remember last year I was on a panel when we talked a lot about media literacy. It's how do you're a 16-year-old kid or 18, doesn't matter. All the media, all the news about what's going on around the world, if we forget sort of the celebrity stuff, you get from social media. You get it, I don't know, whatever channels are now, TikTok or whatever, maybe something newer that I don't even know it exists. But how do you actually find out that what you are seeing there is actually comes from a reliable source? Mainstream media or any other media, it could be very good online media, it doesn't have to be sort of traditional media in that sense. How do you find out, or you have to have this knowledge that when you read it, watch it, listen to it, whatever, that you spot this is so obviously wrong, or check it, exactly. But you need to have these skills. I'll give you one small example. I was in sort of the 2 years during COVID. It's very unscientific. It's just like watching the debate and also taking part sometimes into sort of the, pro-vaccination, anti-vaccination. I don't want to start a debate now because that's very polarized, as we talked before. But you could see, for example, some things were like really obviously wrong. And to my side, and I'm old, so I could spot it immediately. But I was thinking, would somebody who is like 18 really realize that this does not come from a reliable source? Because I read some sort of study, and it basically says that somebody, your neighbor, sort of posting something on Facebook, for example, which looks like a media story, it's exactly the same value as, I don't know, the BBC or CNN or the mainstream media. For them, that was like, yeah, it's news. It looks like news. I don't really know which one's better. And the other thing is, you have to be a little bit smarter. I came up with something, but I think it was called like Japan Times or something, and had like these posters, sort of something saying, I don't even know what it was. And it was also because I'm a geek, sort of went like, sorry, that doesn't really, it's not correct, because you go back or you want into at the footer, you want to click on like find out more or whatever, and you realize this. So I realized it was a fake news, and I sort of posted it saying like, look, if this is spreading around, it's fake. But you need knowledge about this. You need to have tools. You need to be trained in a way or told about it. So what I'm trying to say is, I think media literacy is also very important, so that we can spot, because then we can also take control of the narrative, as we were talking about.
Well, it's also true that people around the world, and it's not country specific, the masses always tend to believe the worst. So good news is never news. Eliane, I wanted to ask you, I know you don't work for Twitter, but since you are so heavily invested in Twitter, more and more politicians are taking to Twitter, and of course Instagram, Facebook, to put out their message. But that apart, we have discussed it, but that apart, what is also happening is mainstream media, so as not to get totally squeezed out of the public space, has made Twitter, Facebook a part of its extension platform. Now, there's a problem here. Because of what you refer to as democratization of the news space, of the information space, people also tend to check out whether what is being put out by a newspaper or a television channel, news channel, whether it is factually correct. And then they do their own fact check and they put it down over there. So this democratization by itself may be good, but then it also puts a big question mark on media credibility. It cuts both ways. It works against media, and it also works against the new media. So
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, because from what Yulia was saying, I agree with her fully. That fact-checking has been in media organizations for a long time.
In mainstream media,
but also with social media platforms. So Twitter has an army of fact-checkers, and they also but use us council members to ask them for information quickly. And so, for example, during COVID, during crisis management issues like elections, they come to the council members and trusted partners. So trusted partners are people, non-profits, in countries that they could quickly ask about something that's erupting, that's becoming viral, and say, is this a reliable thing that's happening? What is the context surrounding this issue? Because sometimes you use a negative word or a slur or insult, but is it contextually something that is actually harming a group of people or individuals? And so we ask these partner organizations. So there are fact checkers already.
Pardon me, that is from Twitter's perspective.
Yes, correct.
What I'm saying is that the platform then also becomes a fact checker of mainstream media content. And a lot of mainstream media has been discredited because of this democratization of the information.
I'm not sure we do that. We basically...
No, Twitter doesn't do it.
Yeah.
It's an observation.
It is a valid observation. So, but basically what happens in Twitter is that whatever you post and you report to us, we will check to see. That we have certain rules about when we take down. We don't take down everything. For us, it's freedom of speech. I'll say us, but Twitter's council position too is freedom of speech. And then we like to contextualize what information there is. And so if you see something that's problematic, you might see a label and you say, do you really want to retweet this? Do you want to read more information, and direct you to more information? And so kind of the work that we've done with technology and surveys is that if there's harmful content, we put a label on it, and we actually have found out that generally 30% of people who've seen this label changed their tweet and or deleted it. And so that's still not a very good number in terms of statistics. 30% is not great, but we're working on this process. And so for us, it's a step forward because Twitter believes, well, Jack Dorsey, he's left now, but he believed in the mental resiliency and mental health of people. And that's why I've stayed on as long as I did. I wanted to quit at some point when it came to what was happening in the US. But no, I mean, for us, we don't actually fact check news organizations. That's their job. Whatever is reported to us, we will fact check. But really, it's about it is about illegal content and harmful speech.
There is a fissure over there. If you're going to fact check what I put out on Twitter, but you won't fact check what a newspaper or a channel.
No, we will fact check whatever is reported. And there's actually guidelines on what will come under that line. Yeah.
Okay, just moving on. Now, there is also this thing about algorithmic obesity. That there is this perception that algorithms are designed in a manner that weigh in for the platform and not always in a neutral manner. Do you, and language becomes a problem, context is often lost, and because of that, the content also gets skewed. Would you like to weigh in on that? And then I would ask you to come in on it.
Maybe I'll in algorithms and the language issue, we talked earlier about that. I'm sure you have reported, some sort of content on Twitter or Facebook, it doesn't matter, I'm sure somebody has, right, in this room. Exactly. So was it done in English or in other languages? Okay, let's put English up. Does anybody? Yes, okay. Was it taken down, let's say, or changed or something? No. What about those who have reported in other languages, let's say, than English or the main languages? Okay, it wasn't. And that's, okay. Okay, I'll just tell you my experience, for example, when we talk about, disinformation that is out there, which is one part, and the other part is when you just basically have hate speech or like just really bad comments that are there. So I had a job for about 2.5 months being governance communication officer. So I used my Twitter, which by the way was my personal, but I use it for work purposes. It's a very blurred line there. So it wasn't what I'm trying to say, it wasn't an institutionalized Twitter account. And I posted something, and the comments were really awful. So I would report them, and I would say that I don't think, it's probably 99% was not taken down. It wasn't changed or anything. And my little theory, and the same goes with Facebook, actually, to be very honest, is because I always say Twitter and Facebook don't speak Slovene. It's a minority language, and I don't think they understand the context, as I said before, of what it is. So it has words, and maybe those words are in the algorithm or not. And the second thing is, it could be done differently. You can misspell the word. Still, we all know what it means, but it's missing one letter, so we still know what it is. And it's just doesn't understand, that I post something and I'm getting all this hate speech and I want to take it down. Or, okay, that's a personal thing, but also comes for disinformation. It's no, this is blatantly wrong, but it's in Slovene or, I don't know, Serbo-Croatian maybe it's better because it's a big language. But my experience is, talking about this, is that I think one part of how we can regain the narrative or we can get real information out and we can counter disinformation, that we need to get these algorithms and whatever is in behind it, I'm not a techie person, to also be able to sort of do something with the languages which are not the main languages.
Kanchan, if I can just respond briefly.
Yes, sure.
So I don't defend Twitter. I think you're absolutely right. Twitter is only working on 34 languages and is not Slovenian. So you do have Hungarian, you do have Swedish. So we can start a dialogue about why that is. And because for me, it's important to have the language in there so you actually can check using the algorithmic process. Because like you said, it will be filtered out because we don't actually understand and recognize the language. So it's really important.
But it's not just Twitter. We are talking of the larger issue.
Oh, for sure. But I'm just saying from a Twitter point of view. But also, for those of you who have raised your hands and you didn't get any people responding to you at Twitter, my name is Eliani. You will see in the program. So because my name is so unusual, my parents were hippies. You'll find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and if you Google me, it's just Eliani. I'm the only one in the world. So you just tweet at me, and I can respond to you to see how I can help you in any way. If it's something that's usually if it's something that's really a big thing for your government or institution, I'll be happy to help.
That's you're inviting a flood of.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm trying to do good.
Yes, sir.
Unfortunately, there's a billion Marcins out there, so I'm very far. I'm very far from you.
You're safe.
Yeah.
Sorry.
But still, if you want to contact me, please go ahead. You'll find also on Google how to do this. But to the point, I think combining sort of the questions about media and algorithms, I can give you an example of what we do to try, and in a subtle way, not a ham-fisted way, at least I hope we're being kind of subtle about this, using, because most of our comments pertain to YouTube as a content hosting platform with things like search are just different as a catalogue of what other people are doing. But we have greater control over what happens on YouTube. So what we try to do, not just remove things, as I said, there's the really egregious things that do get removed, but we also try and do something. We have the 4 R's of responsibility. One of them is to raise authoritative voices. And most of these voices, and actually if you go to your, I don't know if you use YouTube, perhaps some of you do, there should be news shelves or breaking news shelves, and what populates these shelves are actually sources from trusted mainstream media providers. Mm-hmm. So there is still, I think, a great role for the traditional media to play, and we also we have multiple programs across the world to help traditional or quality or professional, however you wish to call them. I don't like mainstream media. Mainstream are tabloids. And unfortunately, tabloids are not the kind of media we want to promote, right? If you look at really bad disasters in the political sphere where a lot of disinformation was peddled, like, say, Brexit, what role did the mainstream tabloids play in that? They just lied for years about the European Union. So, being a mainstream media, it doesn't really mean you don't do disinformation. But anyway, the quality media, I think definitely we try to raise them, we try to feed them in, and also that they help the algorithm determine what is proper news, what is a good source, what is, what is factual. So there is a feedback loop, sort of, and media also, I think you mentioned this, there are a lot of new digital media peers that are quality media. They are doing a great job, and they are using platforms as a way to do their job. People like Vice News, I think they're doing a tremendous job, and they appeared fully digital. So it's not, again, I like to challenge that the kind of quality mainstream media is going away, and now we're going to have, citizen reporting or something, with people on Twitter. I don't think that's going to happen. People want to turn to professionals or authority, and I think, and we're trying to help that. We're trying to maintain a sort of baseline of what should be trusted reporting, and hopefully we're going to do a decent job about it.
Just by way of feedback, we have a huge menace of bogus news channels on YouTube in India. They run stuff like Russia has dropped 10 atom bombs on Ukraine. Stuff like that. And I'm just giving you an absurd example. And then that goes viral, and you have millions of viewers, and the replies which they post over there. And every time we approach Google to take down these channels or to block them, there is great resistance because, and pardon me for saying this, there's revenue attached to it. And Google officials, unofficially, they say this, that we are under pressure not to keep on taking down channels because there's revenue attached to it. But moving on.
That shouldn't be the case.
But I'm just sharing
Just make it clear
Since I come
that is not company policy and shouldn't happen.
Yeah, but
I will have to call my Indian colleagues.
Yes. And the last round, they took 48 hours when it was like, one of the headlines was what I just now told you.
very quickly react on that too. So I really appreciate the initiatives being done by Twitter and Facebook and Google, etc. I think there are really good things going on. But I have to also share some experiences. I work a lot in the area of organized crime and public security, etc. In my coverage. And when I do research, we just published an article, a colleague of mine, in a book, because we did like long years of research in social media about criminal gangs and cartels, etc., on TikTok, for example. And of course, I think we had that in a panel in the morning. You cannot have like millions of fact checkers, right? And you have good algorithms working, but even those should be improved, because when I remember, I've seen, a lot of torturing, murdering, a lot of blood going on in social media related to criminal gangs in South America, for example. And you still, although the algorithms actually must recognize the words and the content in the pictures, there are several strategies actually to let those videos online. And those are really violent videos, torture and killing people. And this is people do that, like you have certain people, for example, giving example of a girl digging her own grave before she gets shot. This is a regular thing going on in criminal gangs in South America. And, actually that should be taken down, right? But there is a method where you edit a certain video and you just, for example, cut it before the shot is being given, and then maybe the algorithm thinks, okay, there is a girl gardening somewhere, so and it's not recognized, and this gives a lot of clicks, and of course legally it's okay, because actually you don't see the end, exactly of what is happening. So I think there must be a lot of things still done. As I said, I think I appreciate really the initiatives, but I think the algorithms are not at its best yet. And of course, you cannot have so many people checking this. And even there, you have people sitting in the Philippines, for example, and seeing numerous pictures every day, and they cannot contextualize, right? So I think these are really huge challenges we have.
No, my intervention was more that even when government approaches with evidence, the response time is not very prompt. Anyway, just moving on.
Can I just add? I think, yes, just talking about how we, trying to get some answers from this. I think one would be taking down the content, I think, which, for example, if it's taken down in one country, I don't know, as I said, I'm not a techie person, I'm just, taken down in one country, how can, reappears in another country? How can that be spotted better, faster, so it's taken down in other countries as well? I mean, we've seen this in COVID when I was looking at sort of something appeared in, I don't know, in Serbia, and then was taken down there, and then appeared in Slovenia. So I think one of the solutions could be, I think, taking things down, but also making sure that the same content doesn't appear somewhere else again in a day or two. I think that could also be...
No, but just let me remind you that under current laws, there is no global takedown. So they will just make it country-specific, that a video like, for instance, what she mentioned, that somebody is being shot dead or killed or whatever, they will block it in one country, but it is available around the world. So therefore it doesn't...
Just to clarify, there are local laws where this is our practice. Yeah. Local laws, that is something that makes it illegal in a given country. Yes, but if we find it against our policies, and of course murder videos would be definitely against any policies, we take it down globally. So it just depends on the legal basis. The data protection law in Europe is a good example. Yeah. When we get a right to be forgotten so-called request, we remove it in Europe, but it's still available
in
elsewhere.
other places.
Yeah. So it depends on the source.
Now, this is something for Jani, since you are working with government on this. What are the institutions and individuals and innovations that emerging economies or developing economies must invest in to meet the emerging challenges of the new information order?
So,
What is your prescription to them?
so our prescription for that is along the lines of what I mentioned at the top. I think it's just to take it one step deeper. I think in the last 4 or 5 years, we at the State Department and the Global Engagement Center have had to, for all intents and purposes, adapt to this kind of new digital order, quote unquote, to be able to meet the challenge of the day. And so it was essentially from a blank canvas, investing in one or two buckets that I mentioned previously, and one of them is definitely what I refer to as the foundational pillar on the analytics front. But it's investing in the right skill sets to bring that on, which is sometimes harder for governments, as you know. Private sector often has sometimes more perceived, lucrative benefits, et cetera. But getting people that are able to not only use commercially available tools, but the ability to maybe build your own custom tools. So investing in data scientists, technologists, and then subject matter experts that all are able to work under one team. So not just that investment, but it's also the political, I guess, willingness to bring those people on and recognize the benefits of having such a team in your, ex-government ministry to be able to inform your principals, ambassadors, state secretaries, et cetera, to respond to the threat of disinformation. And the second thing is kind of what we were just talking about, having the right relationships. And, I think what we were just talking about completely hits the nail on the head from a government perspective, where when we started having a liaison to Silicon Valley, it kind of what you alluded to, it wasn't necessarily the best of relationships, because we had to figure out each other, how each other works, priorities, etc. And I think the real game changer was around when the pandemic hit, because we did see a lot of disinformation, misinformation, etc., particularly from some state actors, where then we were able to work much closer with all of the tech companies and build that relationship and have that trust, where then we saw, just to be clear, we obviously can't tell the tech companies what to do, but we can present evidence to them, and it's up to them to take something down. But we saw that response rate, sometimes within 6 hours, 8 hours of taking down a malicious fake website. I think investing in those relationships, as simple as that sounds, is not that easy, but taking the time to do that is something that will pay dividends. So I think for emerging democracies that want to be successful in this all around, not to sound like a broken record, but those are the two things that I would recommend investing in.
Okay, a quick question for all of you. Come up with a quick response. We all support the idea of taking down content for whatever reason. But when does a takedown become censorship? Starting with you.
I think Twitter has a policy of not doing takedowns. It's a measure of last resort. And so when you talk about censorship, then it really becomes a political thing. I'm not sure where that's happening right now. I mean, I'm going to be very careful with my answers, because at the end of the day, it's a very political issue. So I'm going to sidestep that question, because for me, it becomes a political issue. Censorship is about politics, and Twitter tries not to get meddle in that.
Yeah, I don't think we have an official position on this, but if I were to answer, I would agree that it's the motive. If you're censoring, it means you're trying to suppress a political opponent. I think that's the definition.
What you said is just absolutely correct. For me, censorship, it's a political issue, something that, I wouldn't do, but it has to be, but it is the line is blurred. I can tell you from my personal experience, just over the last 2 months, is that, when I told people I'm going to take down, I'm going to block you if you're going to be, spreading hate speech about me or giving racist remarks about me, they said, oh, you're doing this because we don't agree with you politically. So it's a very manipulated, issue as well. But for me, to answer your questions, it is, censorship is, where you politically says, I don't agree with you. But it is being manipulated, and so we have to be careful about it, that we're saying we're bringing down disinformation is one thing, and being sort of political censorship is something completely different.
Yeah, 100%. It's political, but I think that we can also debate the effectiveness of takedowns, and it's very context dependent. If a website is taken down as it's perceived to be portraying itself as something that's not, spreading complete Russian disinformation, it doesn't matter, right? They can pop up a new website again. So maybe it does matter if it is an effective website and has a lot of readership and gets a captivated audience. So that's the way that, from my perspective, I would approach this, and it's something that's definitely context dependent and debatable.
So yeah, everything has more or less been said. Yeah, it's political, of course. If there is a political actor in power to be able to have an influence in all these private companies or whatever, to be able to take down the content, yes, then that is censorship. And this can change, of course, every time a government or whatever changes. So, right.
Cool. And the last question, and then we move into Q&A with the audience coming in. And it's open to all. Is it time for countries to consider either groups of countries come together or think in terms of a global legal architecture which will deal with the rough edges of the new information order in terms of disinformation, in terms of malicious content, in terms of influence peddling, in terms of political intervention? So what is the way out? I mean, right now we have the DSA and the DSM, and but largely the experience has been that the tech platforms insist our rules shall prevail over your sovereign laws. So that creates a trust deficit. So how do we overcome it? I mean, this is not to sort of rein them in or to put them down, but to have some sort of a universal legal architecture.
I agree with the point that that tech platforms rules prevail over sovereignty. I would not be Twitter if that was really the case. So no, actually, Section 230, yes, applies to the US, and yes, Twitter and other social media platforms in the US are not responsible for third-party content, yes, and that could change. But the rest of the world, yes, Twitter is in Dublin for various reasons, but Twitter does respect the sovereignty of countries and just does try to work with the governments during crisis during crisis and elections and all these things that we've been talking about. If the Indian experience is different, we can talk about it with Twitter India.
No, it's not only the Indian experience. There are other countries which have come up with this issue. Let's not make it country specific, and let's focus on should we look at some sort of a global legal architecture?
Definitely. I mean, of course, there's merit in that, and I think the DSA is the right approach, and I'm very much for it.
And any suggestions, what all aspects it should look at?
Well, with the DSA is really interesting, right? Because it will set the legal precedents in terms of rule setting, because you'll be among the first to promulgate laws regarding this thing. And within the EU space, you know that enforcement will be done really well. My fear as a person that has a nonprofit, and I'm doing the kind of work that I do on trafficking, for instance, or people in this kind of similar spaces, the kind of work that we do, that's, countries that would try, that would be more autocratic, could say, oh, we're taking the DSA law and copy and paste some of this stuff, and put away dissidents or people who are journalists, and then you don't have a due process for justice. So that for me would be problematic, because you have an example here in place in fantastic legal enforcement, things like that, that doesn't exactly happen in many other countries. And so how do we make sure that countries that try to follow after the EU and what's been happening here, there is some kind of global body, or I mean, the global body would be one way, but some kind of a peer review process, if you will, to make sure that people are safe, that people won't be put away.
Marcin?
Yeah, I too dispute that we put our terms of service above local laws. We don't. As I said, we do honour, and actually the Indian example is quite timely, because we just removed a number of false news channels in India, having received an order from the ministry. So we definitely do not flaunt local laws. We do, in certain cases and certain places, do review them for conformity with both the law itself, the local law, and international legal standards too. Why? Because we operate sometimes in places where law can be abused. You know, you wouldn't want us, well, we're not in Russia anymore, but that is a good example. Right? Would you want Google to provide information on all Russian dissidents if asked by the local government? You probably wouldn't, right? And neither would we want to provide it unless there is real legal basis. So the local Russian authorities, when they came to us with a warrant that was sound and pertained to an actual violent crime, we would honour it. But if it was information that we're seeking about a dissident, we would refuse it. So,
but would Google
but that's
be
not
okay
because
with
we think our terms of service are somehow superior.
But would Google be okay with the overall?
Of course. Yes, I think any sort of discrepancy between laws creates friction and difficulty for us as a global platform. And so kind of moving on to DSA, I think, while not perfect, I think it's a pretty good idea where this should end. So not a very heavy-handed approach and elastic. Lots of transparency. I think this is a good direction to go into, because many of these things would be not such a great problem if we knew who was behind a given piece of information. So I think this is, generally speaking, a good direction. Of course, with caveats, but
Yes.
Nothing is perfect in this world.
Dragan.
Okay, maybe I'll just add, I think if you're looking from an EU perspective and seeing the example from the privacy policy and GDPR, I think DSA, I have high hopes, that's going to set the standards also internationally. I know GDPR, sort of applies to the EU, but it's being copied by other countries as well. So I think that has a potential there. And I was going to throw a crazy idea in there, and I'm happy to have a discussion about it. It's also, I think, the question is about, should we stop the anonymity of sort of users, online? And there's lots of discussion. There's pros and cons, I know, about it, but I'm just throwing it out, to people who are commenting on social media and having profiles of whatever social media platform. Should we really know they're real people or just trolls? I think it's also a question that we, when you talk about regaining the narrative, when you're fighting the trolls, which open daily, it's very hard to get this control back, I think, unless you, I don't know, do something. I don't know. Maybe Jani has an answer to it, how to do it.
The question sounds like the plot of, if anybody's seen Spectre, the James Bond film, where they're trying to get the new global information order. But on a serious note, that is a matter for our legislative branch, thankfully. So different branch of government that would debate in the United States. So I'll pass it to my German colleague.
I didn't know that we have Rowan. Yes, to say the DSA is quite useful, and I have to say the sample for this was the German NetzDG. I don't know if you know that, which was even more rigid, to be honest, and we weren't very happy. We had a lot of debates about it because of freedom of speech, and Germany is very strict on data privacy issues. But the DSA actually was kind of a copy out of that. So I'm very much in favor for an international framework in this case. I do agree.
So should we take that point to the audience on anonymity? Yeah, but I mean, no, this is a very, take a poll. I mean, how many people are for anonymity on the?
Sorry, what is the question?
Four.
Okay. who's in... So to continue being able to be anonymous on... Is that a question? Continue to be anonymous on social media platforms? Okay, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yes, okay. So who wants basically the only people who really know who they are, in their names and faces, I don't know, to be on social media platforms?
So verification of ID.
Yes, sort of verification of ID. Thank you very much. That's a very public policy speech.
Okay, got it.
Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, 5 against 7. Okay.
I would be interested in the countries if you want to reveal this information.
Okay, if the first group tell us who is in the first
No,
group.
I would prefer the second group, though, because they want to be checked ID-wise, so you can tell us the countries, maybe.
You just shout. You don't have to say, like, stand up. Just shout.
Just shout your countries.
For nominee.
Slovenia, yeah. I recognize them,
But see, again, this is the issue I sort of touched upon, that it depends where you are.
Exactly.
Like, it might be a good idea in the US or Europe, but would you like to be mandated to give your ID before you go online? I don't know.
Somewhere else.
I don't want to mention any particular country. I mentioned Russia already, so let's do Russia. Right?
No, but for instance, in China, most of the platforms are banned, prohibited, so it doesn't make much of a difference. But for the record, all my accounts are blue ticked. So I personally feel that if you have views which are strong and you believe in them and you must stand up for them, you should do that without taking recourse to anonymity. But that's my view, and others are entitled to their view. Now, the floor is now open to the audience for questions. Yes, ma'am, we'll start from one side and then move in. I think there's a mic over here. Yeah.
I'm Emily. I'm a researcher at Jigsaw, a unit in Google that researches and builds products for safer technology, or to make the world safer. This is for Dragan. You mentioned early on that you suspected, and I think this is a very fair suspicion, that Slovene might have less resources for content moderation, being a kind of lower population, spoken by fewer people. And I just wanted to ask you, what do you see as the biggest opportunities for how platforms could help? Both the biggest opportunities and I'd say also fears, because I know, like, the Balkans, talking about battle for narratives, there's so many different narratives and groups, and coming from Google, I think our fears are, possibly for maybe acting and not understanding all of that context. So I'm just as interested in the sort of fears of how platforms might help in the wrong way as in what feel like the biggest opportunities.
Thank you.
I think, technology, as I said, I'm not a techie guy, but I'm sure there's technology can help us with all of that. It can help us with algorithms. I think it can help us with understanding language, and, algorithms also learn, as they go along. So I think all of that has to be put together. And I think, for the case from Slovenia, if I think the big tech giants wants to test it in Slovenia, I'll be very happy. We're just enough, I think, population that, I think the sort of margin of error and all of that, whatever they use, I think would be good enough for those to test. As an example, how do you approach this? Maybe more based than, human resources based approach. And I think there must be a technology there, or we should start thinking about it or developing it that would actually help us in cases of of countries that have, like, I don't know, what is the right word? Minority languages.
Does Google have a view on this?
Not specifically, but we definitely are expanding, especially in the misinformation space. That since the war began, we have a special program. Our CEO announced an additional funding for improving local language coverage in the CE region specifically, because it is such a diverse region, and also, as Emily kindly pointed out, a region with many issues. So definitely room to improve. I think we both agree, because even the algorithms that you mentioned, Goran, they need data sets. So basically, the more data, the better the algorithm works, up to a certain point, of course. But something we could maybe work on in the future.
We actually had a discussion just before this panel. That actually Google Translate, into Slovenian has improved drastically over the years. So obviously, it is learning and it is getting better. So I think, we need to, if we start that, I think down the line we will have something. And if we don't start this, nothing's going to change. There's going to be, oh, sorry, too small of a country, it doesn't speak, So, I think it is there, little steps there. I think we can achieve it at the end.
We're coming. Start somewhere. We're coming, but even Google has limited resources.
Yeah. No.
That is disinformation. Yes, ma'am.
So a lot of what we have been talking about is what institutions and journalists can do to counter misinformation, but a lot of people want to be able to fact check for themselves. Like, the reason why Twitter exists is because people have their own stories that they want to share. The reason why social media is so popular is because there are opinions and perspectives that weren't captured in mainstream media or by government. Otherwise, it would be obsolete. And so these central institutions or central governments, central points of authority, you cannot chase every single person who is a bad actor. And so what are the ways that either journalism, tech, or government can empower individuals to be able to do some of that fact-checking themselves, to be able to improve their own literacy on the internet, to basically empower them to not be harmed by the things that they are seeing? Like, what is building the populace's resistance?
I would start, if you don't mind.
Yes.
I think Dragan already mentioned that media literacy, of course, is very important. So I, for example, work for an organization which is called Lie Detectors, and we are independent journalists working in European countries. So we start in the classes, the 5th class, and it goes to the 9th class, and we go into schools and train students in media literacy, because all of them are digital natives. All of them, when we ask them, have smartphones, they have computers, they have pads. And when you ask them, how do you actually read news, it's most of the time via social media. And then we try to debunk fake news, or let's say disinformation, because we don't use the word fake news. And I think we had it before, to pre-bunk as well. So we really sensibilize those students, young children, what they are actually consuming, how they consume, how to read it, how to find the information themselves, to be journalists. Actually, that's what they tell them, or lie detectors, so to be detectors of lies, and to equip them with really tools, technological tools, but of course with their thinking as well, to encourage them to be able to exactly do what you said, to have a certain, security and being able to navigate through all those social media channels.
And just to add to, so Twitter does training for, say, journalists in LMICs who are not so familiar with tech. And so, because sometimes that happens, right? So they don't know how to verify things or how to work in a more quicker way. So we do, Twitter does that. And so, again, DM me, we can talk. And then the other thing is, for my own country, Singapore, we have what we call an alliance for action. So basically partnerships with social media platforms, with the government, and we do listening sessions with the youth to ask them what they need in terms of support, because sometimes we think they're okay, they're not. What else can we use to improve your mental health? What are the things that you're facing in terms of being on campus and maybe seeing online sexual assault and things like that? So there's many ways to come at this. I think media literacy is a big part of it, but there's various ways to go about this.
Thank you. I think we have run out of time. Thank you very much for joining us for this conversation, and thank you, each of you over here. You have been great in sharing your knowledge, your views. Thank you once again.